Let's start slowly. We have an extra half an hour, I was told, so we start a little late and have another half an hour, okay? So lunch will be a little later. And you're welcome to our next panel on citizens' rights. I guess it will also be on non-citizens' rights, all kinds of rights. And I'm happy to announce our next speaker, Justine Lacroix, who's a professor of political science at the Center of Political Theory at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And I just mentioned one of her areas. She worked extensively on the relationship between democracy and human rights. And there's a book, I was just told, it has been translated into English, Human Rights on Trial, which I recommend to everyone because I just read the abstract. That's already is great to me. And she will talk, her paper is titled, What is Left of European Citizenship? Okay. Justine?
Thank you. It's okay like this? Yeah? Okay. So thanks a lot first for inviting me at this very stimulating conference. I'm really delighted to be here. So let me begin with a short quotation. I'm not really a Game of Thrones fan, but on democracy I can say winter is coming. So this statement is not that of a leftist activist, but that made a few months ago by the French judges at the European Court of Human Rights. The French judges who stressed that in Europe, fundamental rights are now being challenged, criticized, and sometimes even ignored. And I think one could say the same thing about European citizenship. And actually, I think that many of us are going, I think many of us who used to work on European citizenship are going for rather a bitter time, witnessing the disappointment of the hopes we held as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, the hopes that the European Union would be a sort of laboratory for a new form of citizenship, which was called a citizenship of rights or a cosmopolitan citizenship. And in order to understand these hopes and also the disillusionment we feel today, let me first perhaps come back to the initial contradiction between human rights and the nation states, a paradox, a contradiction outlined by Hannah Arendt in a now seminal work, and Professor Palombella has already mentioned Arendt yesterday. So please forgive me if you are familiar with this text, but it may be not the case of everybody in this room. So let me simply recall you that in The Origins of Totalitarianism, written in 1951, Hannah Arendt saw a contradiction between these two concepts. And according to her, this conflict emerged with the birth of a nation state as soon as the French Revolution linked the Declaration of the Rights of Man to the demand of national sovereignty. Actually, in the 1789 text, the statement that all men are born free and equal, Article 1 of the Declaration, is almost immediately followed by the claim that all sovereignty resides in the nation, Article 3. And in practice, showed Arendt, the consequence of this original conflict was to reduce the rights of man to those of national subjects. As shown by the example of stateless persons in the interwar, individuals without nationality were cast into absolute illegality. They were left rightsless. Hence, the ambivalent nature of human rights, which in practice are guaranteed only to citizens of a given state. only those citizens, such citizens, enjoy the right to have rights. So Arendt's book is now 60 years old, a period during which we Europeans might seem to have overcome this initial tension between human rights and the nation states. As you know, several texts now provide for protection of the individual irrespective of nationality. We have at the international level the Geneva Convention, on the European stage, the European Convention of Human Rights, which allows an individual of any nationality to bring violation of his or her fundamental rights before the court. But of course, it is above all the European Union that has advanced this denationalization of rights by opening the way towards a type of citizenship which can be said to be founded on two premises. One federal premise and one cosmopolitan premise. And so before coming back in the second part of my presentation to the threats to European citizenship today, let me simply recall what these premises were. So first, the federal premise. Well, many have claimed that European citizenship is not a true citizenship because it is contingent on holding the nationality of a member state. According to the treaty, every person holding the nationality of a member state shall be a citizen of the Union. So, but differently, as you know, states decide who may become a European citizens. But as it has been shown by many lawyers and many specialists of federalism, to say that the European citizenship is not a true citizenship for this reason, this argument passed too quickly over the fact that the primacy of state citizenship was the default situation in all the new federation founded on a voluntary association between previously independent states. This was the case in the first decades of the American Confederation for nearly a century, in fact, from 1777 to 1868. It was only with the adoption of a 15th Amendment passed after Civil War that federal citizenship won out. In Germany, I'm speaking, of course, here under your control, but as far as I know, citizenship of a federated state counted above national citizenship until 1934. And Switzerland's federal constitution still provides that any person who is a citizen of a commune and of a canton to which that commune belongs is a Swiss citizen. So what is more, in these associations of states, in these initial associations of states, federal citizenship meant in the first place the right to move freely between the member states and to enjoy the same rights as citizens of the receiving state. We need also only to think here of Article 4 of the American Constitution of 1787. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privilege and immunities of citizens in the several states. And so these two facts, the right to free movement and state's duty to grant the same treatment to their own citizens and those of their sister states, these two elements, these two facts form what we can call the inner kernel of federal citizenship. These federative rights demonstrate the function of federal citizenship in emerging federation to erase the distinction between national and non-nationals. And of course, there are striking similarities between this early type of federalism and European construction. The benefits of European citizenship, as you know, include in the first place the right to move freely between EU countries, Article 45 of the Charter, and even to settle freely anywhere in Europe and to enjoy almost the same rights as host country national. Except in limited sectors, the guiding principle is now clearly that of equal treatment between national citizens and other Europeans. And consequently, one could say that the nature of European citizenship corresponds to that of a federation of free states. So now that's for the federal premise. Now the cosmopolitan premise. Beyond a federal model of citizenship, European citizenship has also been seen or conceived as a laboratory for cosmopolitanism. Some authors have understood Europe as a unique political model representing the first incarnation of a principle of Kantian cosmopolitanism. Well, let me simply recall that in 1787, Kant had envisioned a federation of free states which would lead to a perpetual peace, rejecting the idea of a world state in favor of a league of independent states. Cosmopolitan law, in other words, the transnational law that creates a relationship between a state and citizens of another state, cosmopolitan law was limited to the condition of universal hospitality, namely the right of a foreigner not to be treated as an enemy. Well, again, the European Union has moved far beyond this basic right to visit, recognizing European citizens' right to settle in another member state. And what is more, and this is explicitly recognized in Article 45, rights in this development are no longer restricted to citizens of the European Union, since several texts have moved towards a partial harmonization of status between European citizens and long-term residents from another country, and thus, so more or less towards a citizenship of residence. So, in other words, the distinction between nationals and foreigners, a distinction which is one of the founding facts of a nation state, seemed to be crumbling away. That said, the nation state was not in danger of disappearing, still standing at the heart of European decision-making process. And instead, the EU seemed to open the way towards a democracy. I think that Philippe was the first one to introduce this expression, which was then elaborated by numerous scholars, most famously by Calypso Nicolaidis, a democracy or federation of democracies based on several national peoples granting each other equal rights, but without consolidating themselves into a single demos. And the hope, at least my hope, 15 years ago, was that the European construction would gradually modify the way in which national groups represent themselves. This hope was, for example, expressed in a famous paper written by Joseph Wheeler on the meaning of European citizenship. In this paper, published, I think, in 2001, he was expressing the hope that the principle of voluntary plural affiliation would encourage Europeans to question the founding ideas of identity politics, and that it would open the way to a mutual recognition not only of European culture, but also of other culture. And it is in that sense that mutual recognition between European peoples was conceived as a laboratory for a type of cosmopolitanism that respects national pluralism. And instead of a contradiction suggested by Arendt, a virtuous circle seemed to be taking shape between national belonging on the one hand and recognition of universal rights on the other. So, the threats now, two threats. There are far more than two threats, but I will focus on two of them. So, why talking now about disappointment of these hopes? Well, the benefits represented by European citizenship certainly did not evaporate overnight. But I think we can identify at least two elements of doubt and weakening of this notion of citizenship in both its cosmopolitan and its federal dimension. So first, the cosmopolitan dimension. Well, first of all, and I think it is one of the issues of this workshop, it seems that the conditions imposed on migrants in today's democracies, in today's European Union, is a bit a slur on previous aspiration to denationalize rights. And these conditions show that in times of crisis, human rights are rapidly in danger of being reduced against to rights of national citizens. And actually, one can say, it seems to me that the migration control policies implemented in and by the EU itself or its member states, these migration policies are giving new reality to the figure of a rightsless drawn by Arendt. This may seem as an exaggeration, since, as I said, there are no legal texts that protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of nationality. But this reply would be, for me, to miss the real meaning of the concept. To be rightsless, Arendt believed, was not to be deprived of this or that particular right. As she said, a criminal may be deprived of free movement without becoming rightsless. To be fundamentally deprived of one's human rights, Arendt wrote, is above all to be deprived of a place in the world which makes opinion significant and action effective. Consequently, a rightsless person is one who is deprived of a social fabric that makes it possible to claim rights. Now, what does the Dublin Convention, in decreeing that asylum demands must be filled in the first country of EU arrival, if not make it very difficult to assert such claims? Italy and Greece have been overwhelmed, and these claims are declared non-receivable in other countries, which in turn have only relocated a third of the 160,000 migrants they had agreed to admit in 2015. What is achieved by the agreements with authoritarian states such as Turkey, Libya, Sudan, if not to prevent migrants of people from claiming their right to have rights where they have some chance of being heard? To come with another example, what of European courts of justice claim that it has no jurisdiction over the issue of whether a state has the duty to grant a humanitarian visa in order to register an asylum claim? So maybe let me develop a little bit this example. I'm talking under the control of lawyers. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I love reading cases and ruling because I think you learn a lot about political philosophy while doing. So I think this last example is important because it really provides a concrete illustration of this notion of rightslessness. So in the present case, a Syrian couple living in Aleppo went to the Belgian consulate in Beirut in October 2016 to apply on their behalf and on behalf of their 3 children for a visa under Article 25 of the European Code of Visa, which provides that a state may issue a visa on humanitarian grounds for a maximum period of 90 days. So the couple and their 3 children lived in a place of military clashes, and one of them claimed to have been kidnapped and tortured before being released for ransom. So this humanitarian visa was refused by Belgium. So referral for a preliminary ruling was made to the Court of Justice of the European Union on the question of whether a state is obliged to issue this humanitarian visa if its refusal risks exposing the applicant to inhuman and degrading treatment, which would constitute a violation of Article 4 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the issue, the case was to know if there was an obligation to deliver this visa. So under pressure, of course, you can imagine the pressure from the Commission and all other member states, the court declared itself incompetent on the grounds that European visa code only concerns stays of less than 90 days. Actually, this was the case for the visa applied for, but the court stated that the applicant's real intention was to establish themselves over a long period of time since they attended. They never hide that. They never hide their intention. They intended to apply for asylum once in Belgium. Now, several lawyers have pointed out the fragility of the intention criterion for measuring the scope of a text, but that's not my point here. For my pupils, the main point is the lesson that Advocate General had drawn before the court, namely that the refusal to deliver a humanitarian visa leaves little alternative for men and women who are victims of persecution, but to be caught and exploited by criminal networks whose dismantling is nevertheless the stated objective of the European Union. They have no legal way of claiming their rights. They are deprived of the opportunity to access a polity where their voice can at least be heard. And so it seems to me that it's worth recalling what Arendt wrote about the interwar period, not the loss of specific rights then, but the loss of a community willing and able to guarantee any rights whatsoever has been the calamity which has befallen over increasing number of people. So this is the first threat or failure, I don't know, but it's difficult as things stands today to see European citizenship as the cutting edge of cosmopolitan principle. And Andreas, in his opening, in opening this workshop yesterday, was asking, does migration policy affect European values? Well, as you have guessed, for me, The answer is clearly yes. The refugee crisis is certainly, above all, the crisis of Europe. So, and the crisis of meaning of European adventure. So, the first, let's come now to the second threat. The federal threat, I would say, a threat to the European polity, the European citizenship conceived as a citizenship in a federation of states. Well, here the concern is with democracy within member states. For a long time, I think it was fair to describe the EU as a federation of democracies. If European institutions themselves could be accused of suffering of democratic deficit, I think no one could deny that belonging to the Union was a crucial factor in establishing and extending the rule of law on the national stage, as shown in the early 90s by the examples of Greece, Spain, and Portugal. I think that belonging to the European Union has helped stabilizing these new democracies. But now it has become clear that one of the biggest challenges in building a political union in Europe lies in national democratic deficits, as shown by the emergence of what I call authoritarian regimes. I don't like the concept of illiberal democracies. Maybe we can come back to this, but for me there is not such a thing as illiberal democracy. So as shown by the emergence of authoritarian regimes in Hungary, Poland, and Romania. So why is it a problem for a federal citizenship? I mean, we can say, well, that's a national problem. It's not a problem for a federation. Well, because what is called the federative homogeneity criterion, namely the duty of a member state to respect some shared political principles, was of key importance for the founding philosophers of federal thought. This is true of Montesquieu, who in L'Esprit des Lois stipulated, quoting, that the federative constitution must be made of states of the same nature, particularly of republican states. Similarly, the federalism of free states, imagined in Kant's Perpetual Peace, posits that the civil constitution of each state must be republican, that is founded on liberty, equality, and dependence, fraternity. The sharing of political values also plays a crucial role in Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of American federation's conditions for success. And actually, this federative homogeneity criterion also comes into several federal constitutions in the form of a federal guarantee to ensure preservation of a republican model. This is, for example, the function of Article 4, Section 4 of the US Constitution, which the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Article 51 and 52 of the Swiss Constitution, Article 28 of the German Basic Law. And of course, as you know, there is a partial equivalent of this homogeneity criterion in the EU treaty, since Article 2 provides that the Union is founded on the value of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, etc. And of course, the most important is the Article 7 mechanism introduced by the Treaty of Amsterdam, providing for a possible suspension of the voting rights of a country found to be in violation of Article 2 principle. This is something very close to a federal guarantee, a federal right to intervene in internal affairs of the states. And in a commentary on this article, 7, the legal theorist Olivier Beau, the French legal theorist Olivier Beau, pointed out in 2004, quoting, that its application or attempted application would be a real trust test for the Union, one in which cannot know which party would win. And so we are now at the actual point of truth test, since the Commission proposed that this mechanism be set in motion for Poland in 2017 and Hungary in 2018. But yet, as you know, there is almost no chance that these procedures will be successfully concluded, since they rest on the premise that all states should recognize the violation of Article 2. And so it seems to me that we are facing either a truth test or a deadlock. I don't know. Well, either the EU does not succeed in answering respect of the rule of law in its own member states. And it seems to me that in this case, it would be threatened from within. The Union's lack of power to enforce respect for its moral and political authority would then be plain for all to see. And it's of course a question, an issue of values, but let me stress that what is at stake, it's not only values and principles, but also the very possibility of European cooperation. The European Union is based on the principle of mutual recognition. That is, that standards adopted by one state are presumed equivalent in others. But how can judicial and police cooperation take place between states that do not offer the same guarantees in terms of court independence or respect for individual freedoms? The case was raised in July 12th, last July, actually, when the European Court of Justice gave permission to a state, Ireland, not to execute a European warrant issued by Poland if the Irish judges considered that the right to a fair trial would not be respected in that country. So the first solution might be, might lead slowly but surely reducing the European Union to the status of a mere international organization. Of a showdown, the second possibility is that the EU managed to ensure member states' respect for Article 2, for example, using structural funds, to exert pressure on this country. But with the risk now of denying the denying national states their power of self-determination. Because whether we like it or not, these governments have come to power by elections. And returning to perpetual peace and to Kant, when Kant envisioned a federation of free states, he underlined that no state must intervene by force in the constitution or government of another. Such intervention of exterior powers, Kant argued, would constitute a scandal and put the autonomy of all states in danger. But the problem is that we are now facing an issue that neither Kant nor the authors of the treaties, I think, seriously envisage. It may be easy to refuse to admit a state that fails to respect republican principles to the federation. But what are we to do when a state or several states de-democratize once already a member? And more generally, it leads me to wonder sometimes if a model of the EU as a federation of free states has not reached its limits where it will be forced to admit that it must, either slowly but surely, disintegrate into a diffuse international organization or move towards a federal state model. And I think when listening to yesterday and this morning also, I was asking myself, it's maybe also the same question about social justice. Catherine Audard was talking about the risk of European mobility maybe for national welfare system, and it's also the same problem. Can the European Union pursue social justice and free movement of persons without moving towards a federal state? I mean, I think the question is open today. So in my conclusion, I'm afraid it's not really in conclusion because I do not suggest what we should do. It's not more optimistic than the introduction because both days are coming. It seems to me that these two violations of a promise of European citizenship I've just described, it seems to me to provide a concrete illustration of the general warning issued by Michaela Elbronner in a recent editorial, Both days are coming. And I agree with what she says. What she says is that she concluded her editor saying, when we think about necessary change, we also need to consider what it is we want to preserve. To some, this may seem a lack of ambition or defeatism. I disagree. We cannot and we do not need to free change of risk, but we need to think about what our safeguards are. We have an obligation to think about our safety nets and how we can ensure they hold, even as we, or some of us, may pursue radical reforms. And in a similar vein, I'll talk in a very different style. The philosopher Etienne Balibar recently declared, and I loved this expression, so I picked it up for myself. He declared, the defense of the institutions is also the insurrection. And this may be the reason why I have not put forward any bold proposals today that could transform the meaning of European citizenship, maybe at the risk of disappointing you. Not that these proposals are not necessary, but it seems just as important today in the current situation to insist on the fragility of what has been achieved in order to reflect together on the best strategy to defend it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine, for this clear and quite alarming presentation about the very meaning of the European Union and how we might lose it, actually. So the discussant will be my friend François Boucher, who's on the team of NovaMigra and who will unfortunately leave us for the Université de Louvain. So Belgium is growing in importance, it seems.
I'll stay around.
Huh?
I'll stay around.
Yes, you stay around, yeah. And he has been working as a political philosopher, in particular about cosmopolitanism recently. Did a great job on this. So, looking forward to you.
Well, thank you, Volker, for the introduction, and thank you, Justine, for this wonderful... Sure. Is that better? Good. Okay. Closer? Okay, and I'll speak louder. That's perfect. Great. So thank you, Justine, for this wonderful paper. I don't find much to disagree with because I tend to think that you're right about the kind of diagnostic that you're establishing about the future of the European Union. And so what I'm going to try to do in this paper is just to raise a few questions of clarifications. And so I think in your paper there are two important parts. In the first part of it, you are describing the constitutive elements of the European cosmopolitan federalism dream, of the European dream that was still quite alive 15 or 20 years ago in the early 2000s, basically. And so this European dream is based on this notion of first a federal conception of citizenship and then a cosmopolitan one. And so I'm gonna, and this enthusiasm about the European Union in the early 2000s was about the creation of an allegedly new kind of political order, a distinctive kind of cosmopolitan federalism. And so the first set of questions that I'm going to raise are about the distinctiveness and the novelty of this kind of political order. And so in the second part of your paper, you're discussing about the two root causes, or maybe the two symptoms of the failure of this European dream, the first being the migration and refugee crisis, and the second as to do with the rise of authoritarian populist regimes in several European countries. And I'm gonna sort of raise the question of whether the only way forward to rescue the cosmopolitan dream of Europe is to abandon what allegedly made it distinctive in this period of enthusiasm about the European Union. So this is going to get a bit clearer as I go through. So I'm just going to first start the first series of questions about the first part of the paper, where you describe those two distinctive novel elements of the European Union, the federal conception of citizenship and the cosmopolitan one. So what is distinctive about this federal notion of citizenship is that of a membership in a larger political union that is mediated through membership in a federated subunit. And then what is distinctive about cosmopolitan citizenship is this idea that every human being has a legal standing in a certain polities, independently from its nationality. So the first question that I want to raise is whether the most progressive and novel elements that you associate with cosmopolitan citizenships actually are dependent on the federal conception of citizenship. So the idea that in the European Union, every human being enjoys certain rights that are protected is often tied to this idea of free movement, the freedom of residence. And this is recognized in the EU Charter, that even third country nationals do enjoy this freedom of movement. And as you said, this is something very distinctive and unique to the European Union. But this right to freedom of movement and residence is only granted to third country nationals, provided that they already have a legal residence in one of the member states. So again, it seems that those rights that we're granting to non-European citizens, they only receive it as members of a member state. So this very distinctive element of cosmopolitan citizenship seems to actually be based on the federal understanding of citizenship. But of course, there's more to it in the European dream. There is this idea of a strong version of Kantian hospitality, or of the Kantian notion of cosmopolitan law. As you correctly highlighted in your presentation, Kant's original version of cosmopolitan law and hospitality is very thin, is very minimalistic. And so the promises of the Europe is not just to institutionalize or implement Kant's very exact notion, but is to establish or implement something much more generous than Kant. And so in Kant's version of hospitality, there are three elements. Right? There's the right to seek asylum. Kant maintained that states can deny the entry to foreigners, except when this would lead them to remain in a country where their life is threatened. So it seems to be an early version of the principle of non-refoulement, or the right to seek asylum elsewhere. There's also a very minimalistic right to visit. It's not a right to immigrant in Kant. It's only the right to visit the country, to seek association in a foreign country. So this doesn't grant potential immigrants the right to stay, but just to enter and then to go out. And then there's this notion of hospitality, that foreigners should not be seen as enemies of the state. They should be protected. They should not be subjected to forms of violence, arbitrary detention, and so on and so forth. So my question here is to which extent, how strong this notion of Kantian hospitality in those three dimensions has to be for the EU to be a distinctive kind of cosmopolitan political order, because other countries and states have implemented their own very limited notion of Kantian hospitality by recognizing the right to seek asylum, by granting certain rights to due process to immigrants, even though they are not citizens, and so on and so forth. So what is the baseline where we can say that this is a distinctively strong and novel cosmopolitan kind of order? In the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, several rights that are granted not only to EU citizens or to third country nationals that happen to be to have a visa and to be a legal resident in the member states are very, very minimal rights, such as the right to good administration, the right to petition, and so on and so forth. So again, how strong should be hospitality for the EU to be a distinctively novel kind of cosmopolitan order? And now I want to raise a few questions about the political theory backing the federal part of the European dream. You draw in the paper on the work of Jean-Marc Ferry and Joseph Weiler to claim that the EU as a kind of cosmopolitan federation is novel in the sense that it is a single political order in which all the European peoples are not sort of integrated in a single demos, but remain distinctive demois. And also another element that Weiler identifies as something to be distinctive about the European Union is the weak constitutional discipline, right? When he talks about constitutional tolerance, what he means is that the EU proposes, she doesn't imposes. So there's a mode of decision-making that presupposes dialogue between equal members, but there's no subjection to a common sovereign. We're in the realm of horizontal intergovernmental relations of deliberation and negotiations. And this conception of federalism is strikingly similar to me to what authors such as Iris Marion Young or Jim Tully have associated with certain practices of federal democracy among Native Americans, namely among the Iroquois confederations. And so perhaps yesterday we asked, I think it was Philippe who asked whether actually European values were American values transposed in a new context. And I'm wondering whether the conception of cosmopolitan federalism that has been associated to the EU is not actually a kind of distinctively North American conception of federalism that was practiced by Native Americans and then bring into theory by North American authors. So now I'm just going to quickly raise a few questions about the second part of the paper. Do you guys still have four minutes? Okay. So there are, you correctly identify two existential threats to this European dream, the migration crisis and the authoritarian populist crisis, if you want. I know that you don't want to commit to an answer, to a solution, whether, well, in the paper you leave it open for discussion, but I'm wondering if in the way that you that you establish the diagnostic about what's wrong and what causes those situations doesn't already paves the way to a certain solution, namely to having the EU transforming itself into a federal state. And what I mean is that when you identify the root cause of the migrants and refugee crisis, it seems that you're pointing into the direction of a lack of centralization at the EU level. So this is what we get from the PPU case, where the European Court of Justice claim or denied to have competence to decide that a member state has the duty to grant a humanitarian visa. It seems to point into the direction of saying, well, actually, the court should have this authority, and there should be a more centralized constitutional discipline to make it effective. You also mentioned in the paper the failure of the relocation plan of 2016, where only roughly 30% of refugees have been able to be relocated into a different countries than Italy and Greece. And again, it seems that the cause of this failure was the non-mandatory character of this plan. And so it raised the question of whether or not there should have been, as it was suggested, a mandatory system of quota for resettlement of refugees, which would imply that there is a federal layer of government with a certain capacity of law enforcement and with the capacity to force states to accept refugees. Same thing, when you're talking about the rise of authoritarian leaders in several European countries, you discuss this notion of a federal or federative homogeneity. So this is a partial homogeneity, right? This is not, federalism is always a delicate balance of centralization and decentralization, shared rule and self-rule. And I think it makes sense to claim that there needs to be a democratic core of values and principles respected in all federated states. But again, if you want to guarantee this, it's more likely to be the case that this is going to work if there is a federal government with a capacity of law enforcement that goes beyond mere horizontal intergovernmental negotiation. And as you explain in the paper, the three mechanisms that are in place in the EU to incite member states to follow democratic norms and principles are first criterions of membership. In this case, it doesn't apply because those states are already members. Access to structural funds, but that's not a really good solution because it's going to end up penalizing already poor, perhaps farmers, and perhaps it's going to fuel anti-Europe resentment. And suspension of voting rights for member states also doesn't work because the solution requires a unanimous vote. And so it seems, again, to point into the direction of more centralization in the EU, more federalization. And so I would like to know if why not a federal European Union? Is it only our reluctance to go in this direction only about concern for the feasibility of such a new understanding of the European Union, or there is something undesirable about such a degree of centralization in a political order such as the EU, which is a very important level of national, cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. I'm often surprised when I read the work of scholars of European integration who have very different views, such as Habermas, Weiler, Jean-Marc Ferry, and so on, who always seem to worry that the federal option is going to leave no room whatsoever for local autonomy for the member states. And often they draw a parallel with American federalism in the United States, but this is not the best point of comparison. There are other federations in the world that are explicitly plurinational and much decentralized in terms of the competencies that are granted to federated units. And I wonder whether countries such as perhaps Canada, for instance, provide a better model or better point of comparison to ask the question whether there could be enough autonomy left to member states in a European Union conceived as a federal plurinational state. Okay. Thank you.
So thanks, François. So he wants to push you to show us the way forward, and should we become like Canada?
I don't know. Should I respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go, whatever.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much for these comments. Should we become, let me take the third question as you suggest, but should we become like Canada? Yeah, you are perfectly right to say that actually in the second part of my paper there's an implicit recognition that maybe this federation of independent nation state does not work anymore, and maybe we have reached, as I said, precisely this point, either disintegration or going to a federal state. Why do I not elaborate? I think I can't help thinking about what Philippe said in another context about justice, you know, that we are struck in these two impossibility. Nothing can be done at the national level for social justice, and nothing can be done at the European level either for political reasons. So this dual impossibility. And I would never say the same about all the migration. Of course, I'm convinced that it wouldn't be better if it was dealt at the national level. It's absolutely impossible. There is no other solution but a solution at the European level. And so why do I not elaborate immediately the federal state? Maybe for issue of feasibility. It seems so improbable now, and which countries will be part of this federal state? But maybe I'm wrong here, and I should consider not only the short term, but also the long term, and consider what is normatively desirable and not only what is feasible. I must say that also in the present conjuncture, maybe I'm a little bit afraid of what majority would govern this federal state, this big state. And so there's I'm a little bit careful about, but in theory, I agree with you that it would certainly be the desirable solution. But I'm not advocating a federal state also for another reason, is that you must understand that for me, Europe is not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means for prosperity, it's a means for social justice, it's a means for protecting human rights. But if Europe is not the best way to achieve these aims, I don't care about Europe anymore. That might be the difference with Canada or Europe. And this is my point. So, two other questions. What is so cosmopolitan in the European Union? Very good question, because of course, other countries, Canada, United States also recognize asylum. I would be tempted to say that you are right. Maybe it's not so much the European Union than the European Court of Human Rights, which seems to me as a unique model. I can't think of an equivalent where a person, whatever his or her nationality, not to go to the court, you do not need to be to have a nationality of one member state, you know, can pursue his own state, her own state, or another state for violation of his or her right. This seems to me as something rather unique, but maybe I'm wrong. And so your other question was about the demoid, I don't remember, dialogue, European. What was the second question?
I think about the political theory behind it, and authors that you're quoting in the papers, Jean-Marc and Violet, which seem to be relying on the same conception of federal democracy as Gentili, Augustine, and Young.
Yeah, and that's not so much European. Again, a good remark. I mean, certainly, I agree with this remark. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to invite the audience. Andreas, Markus.
stand up and shout, yeah.
Yeah, just stand up and you can do it, come on.
Yes, thanks a lot for this interesting talk. I have a question that is obviously picking up kind of a short kind of remark you made about the change. But maybe also in light of the whole conference, interested in where you locate the citizenship issue. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights has this interesting classification in the preamble, saying there are these values, and then we have democracy and the rule of law as principles, and then it says, and kind of it places the individual as at the heart of its activities by establishing citizenship of the European Union. And so I would want you to tell us a little more of how you understand this. So one easy way of understanding it could be the use in this case acknowledging that individuals have independent standing vis-a-vis the European institutions, and that's why kind of they have to be provided with citizenship. Then it's not necessarily a value, not even a norm or so, but it's more kind of providing them with a kind of independent status with regard to the institutions. So now kind of given your diagnosis that something is happening with citizenship, I'm now interested in kind of what you think is happening, because what you are describing.
What is happening with
Yeah, the threats you're describing.
Yeah.
When you say, okay, there's definitely something that's affecting your kind of European values. Because I mean the migration, the case that Europe does not make itself accessible anymore to kind of human rights claims or international humanitarian law claims, one could say it's not a failure with regard to
yeah, okay.
but it's the rule of law that is failing. So here I'm interested kind of where is the transformation taking place regarding the whatever citizenship.
So Justine, may I collect a few questions?
Yeah,
Is that okay? Marcus, you were second. Marcus, then Philippe.
Two remarks. One is, I wonder whether we should always think in this dichotomy, nation states, federal systems. A historian from Utrecht, Martin Prak, just published a book, Citizens Without Nations, where he analyzes over a variety of centuries and in a global perspective what kind of possibilities of realizing citizenship exists. Yeah, so in a broader scheme of things. And you find out it's a huge variety where you can reconstruct several mechanisms, but speaking about nations and federal systems is just one of the options of thinking about these things. Yeah, so you can, so I think it would be much more necessary to think in much broader terms about the possibilities of realizing rights protections. And the second thing, I think these questions are cannot be disentangled from the things that states have to realize. Yeah, and so digitalization, climate change, global economy are changing the picture so fundamentally that it doesn't matter whether we call it EU or whatever. Nation states are out of the picture in a pragmatic sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if we hadn't the EU, and we would have to think how to realize the protection of citizen rights in this changing picture. And you see that Europe is so fixated on his own problems or the Western problems. The same problems appear all over the world. China has the same problems to solve, how to think in this changing world about the relationship between the central power in Beijing and the task of the other states. So there's nothing genuinely interesting within Europe we just don't care about the rest of the world. There are specific tasks to be solved, and there are specific responses to this task. And that, I think, is the question we should look to in a broader perspective. And then I don't think that the binary option, nation states and federalism, is the entirety of possibilities to think about it. Yeah, it's just that was a discourse we had over the last centuries in Europe, but probably we are at a point where we have to think about different conceptions. Yeah, and where we end up, I have no clue.
Philippe?
Yeah, my question is about democratization, and it's a bit of an invitation to empathy and perhaps even solidarity with Hungary. Okay, bit of a difficult challenge, but
No.
so the problem is the following. So we have a country that entered fine with. Has a bona fide democracy, and then it started introducing measures that challenged the independence of the judiciary, of the press, and even of academia, to such an extent that even if we can still talk of a democracy, it's certainly a problematic democracy, illiberal democracy, or whatever, and that can be regarded as a serious problem for the European Union. Of course, back to what I said about how we should assess, it depends on whether you compare to what should be or what would have been the case if Hungary was not part of the European Union. But François rightly indicated that the means that are available in order to correct that are not easy to use. In the case of subsidies of various sorts, it may inflict damage. I mean, it may be counterproductive, and sort of really the victims would be the wrong people. And two, if you use Article 7, you need, it's enough to have another country opposing it for the thing to be, not to work. So my thing is, should we really make such a fuss about Hungary? Should we not start off understanding the panic in Hungary? This is a country that has been losing population every single year since 1980. It's a population with a minority language, very hard to learn, and which no one entering Hungary knows to any extent before entering. There is no doubt the overblown terror, thinking horror about the possibility of having lots of people entering Hungary and needing to be integrated without anyone being available to integrate them, because where are, thanks to the European Union, all these highly educated people who could teach them Hungarian or help them integrate? 500,000 of them are in other countries of the EU. So if you have a small nation with a big glorious past and some complex about that, feeling very vulnerable because of the shrinking population, the possibility of people coming in with no particular interest in being in Hungary, no particular interest in learning Hungarian, the possibility that even the beginning of that would happen, with then the suction power that would happen. I can have some empathy for how these people feel. And then they may take measures that are exaggerated, but shouldn't the right attitude of the European Union, the other parties, said, okay, we understand that you have a problem, and instead of taking coercive measures, we are hoping that the sort of civilizing force of hypocrisy will do its job, and that Mr. Orban, having to come day after day, meeting his colleagues, especially in the European People's Party, who said, don't you want to stop your suspension, but then make a little effort, what about your press, etc., etc. Shouldn't this gentle approach be sufficient to deal with what is, after all, a minor problem compared to many others, including all the threats that are involved in post-Brexit European Union? So an invitation to solidarity with Mr. Orban.
No.
more because I see an urgent hand being raised over there. So go ahead, and then it's just Justine. So she wants. You want to say something? Yeah.
I think Mr. van Parijs, this is, I don't know, it is provocative. I think also it is incredibly naive, right? If he was taking the actions on the judiciary, this has nothing to do with what you described. If he was taking the measures against the press, this has nothing to do with what you mentioned. If he has taken the actions against academia, this has nothing to do with this. There is no data showing that these people don't want to learn Hungarian. There is no data. There's no lack of education in Hungary, people being able to teach Hungarian. There's no such thing. This is a mafia state, right? And it's, if you were treating the rhetoric of Orban as what is truly concerned about, yeah, I mean, this is what diplomats do, but you're a philosopher, right? So you should be able to see that simultaneously. I think this doesn't call for empathy. It maybe calls for diplomacy, right? Which is a very different thing.
Okay, thank you so much. So now let's give Justine a chance to answer.
Yeah, well, let me begin with Philippe. I don't want to be misunderstood or to be patronizing or moralizatrice. How do you say moralizing? Moralizing, sorry, difficult to pronounce. I have much sympathy for the Hungarian people. I have no sympathy for Orban, that's for sure. And I just join what just has been said. As far as I know, the Hungarian people elected 10 years ago a liberal, a center-right liberal, known for his attachment to liberal and to freedoms reform. I mean, as soon as he was in power, he has fought over elites in journalism. This is a fight among elites. This is not the will of the people. This is a fight, and he has fought elites in journalism, elites in the press, elites in the academia. And I can't understand the sense of panic due to demography. I'm aware of this problem, but I really do not consider it's a minor problem for the European Union. It's a huge problem. But surprisingly, I join you. Since I said we are a deadlock, I don't think that a showdown will lead to anything. And I don't think the first solution, the Article 7, won't lead to anything either. So I feel, for the time being, we do not have the choice but to support the Hungarian opposition in their effort to back the academia, to back the journalists, to back the ONG, to do all what we can do to support them in their fight against this regime, hoping that maybe in the short term he will lose the election and things will come back to, they will come back to democracy. But what if it doesn't work? I don't know. Then the second question about nation and state, actually, I don't think I was drawing a dichotomy between the nation state or the federation, because you can't have one without the other. There is no federation without nation state. I agree, well, on theory, you are right, states are out of picture. But in practice, I'm sorry, states are everywhere. I mean, we have to count on states. We have to count to protect our rights and to negotiate on climatic change or to rule about, everything is decided by states. The world is organized among nation states. And since I've been a student, I've been told that the time of nation state is over, the time of states is over, that we should imagine something else and have a broader picture, but I still do not see this world for the time being. Which does not mean that the institutional organization is adapted to the new challenge of our time, but we still, to organize democratic activity, to organize democratic mobilization, we have to rely on what we have, and what we have for the time being is a nation state. So Andreas, I perfectly agree with you. If someone reads carefully the charter, my presentation might seem a little bit out of place, because I haven't talked about the right to vote in local election, the right to vote in the parliament election, the ombudsman, and the right to fair administration. Why didn't I? Because I don't think, it's not that these rights are not important, but would you have said to consider that they are rather minor? I mean, such a minority of this is not for me the true meaning of citizenship. Of course, it's important to grant these rights to local election, but it concerns such a tiny minority of Europeans, and even that I've seen some studies, even those living in other member states than their member states use these rights very rarely. I think it's not so much used. So, it's true that but I feel personally, I think we can all feel European citizens if, not only because we have these rights, but because we recognize ourselves in the polity which is being built. And personally, and I think we are numerous in this regard, we recognize ourselves in the European polity if it respects these universal principles enumerated in the first part of the charter. And this is why I've talked mainly about the true meaning of citizenship, of European citizenship.
Okay, so I guess the blood sugar levels are slowly going down, but we would have time for 2 more questions. So it's just an offer, you know? There's still time. Any further comments?
Maybe people are
okay.
hungry.
So
Want to eat.
I thank you all. Thanks, Justine.